It's been reported as just like stopping people based on their race. It's
Thank you for joining us today. Just a couple of quick announcements before we get in. First, live captioning in English and Spanish is available using the closed captions tab at the bottom of your screen, and instructions are in the chat. And then we'll be taking questions towards the end of this program. Please submit them using the questions button on the screen. Thanks again. My name is Dan Herman. I'm the Senior Director for National Security, Accountability, and Reform here at the Center for American Progress. Over the past few weeks, the American people have been witness to a dramatic escalation of the Trump administration's immigration enforcement agenda. We've seen Operation Metro Surge, where around 3,000 agents, most of them from the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which includes Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection, CBP, ICE and CBP. You have 3,000 agents, as well as other federal law enforcement, have descended into the greater Minneapolis area. We've all seen these images: masked agents, abductions and detentions of both citizens and non-citizens, including a 5-year-old child, Liam Ramos, entering homes without warrants, brutality and escalation by federal law enforcement. And these actions accumulated in video footage capturing the tragic killings of Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretti by ICE and CBP agents. These are shocking, but unfortunately this is part of a larger pattern we've been seeing of dangerous behavior over the last year. Americans are horrified, and they're demanding answers. Congress is also demanding answers. Just yesterday, Senator Blumenthal, Representative Garcia held a forum where they could hear directly from people who've been harmed by DHS, both in Minnesota and around the country. We're hoping to see some changes on the ground. This morning, Trump border czar Tom Homan announced that 700 immigration officers would be pulled out of the Minnesota operation. Homan claims this is a response to increased cooperation with local law enforcement. But this is not enough. There's still going to be more than 2,000 agents in the area, which is a dramatic rise over the 80 or so that were there before this operation started. Last week, in response to what we've seen, CAP released a report highlighting a series of specific reforms that DHS and Congress could take right now to rein in some of these dangerous abuses, hold individuals accountable for their wrongdoing. I'm going to sort of summarize these reforms, then turn it to my colleagues here. I'm joined today by Senior Director for Immigration Policy, Debu Gandhi, Ali Preston, the Senior Policy Analyst for Public Safety, Ben Olinsky, Senior Vice President for Structural Reform and Governance. And later in the discussion, we'll also be joined by Laura Rodriguez, who's the Senior Vice President for Government Affairs here at American Progress. Thanks for joining us today to join this conversation. Thanks for the ongoing work on these issues. So there are sort of several categories for reform that we highlighted. First, I think, is that DHS should be held to the same standard as local police, involving banning masks, requiring body-worn cameras, clear uniforms, making sure that we are reforming screening, hiring, training, so that we have the best law enforcement officers on the scene and that we can deal with people who are not supposed to be there. Making sure that we're protecting the integrity of internal investigations, that they're independent, that they're fair, that they're thorough. And then, of course, requiring protections of constitutional rights, dealing with some of these abuses, requiring that DHS follow the law. And then, looking at larger systematic accountability for DHS, making sure it can be accountable to the public and Congress going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ali. She can talk a little bit about how DHS relates to what we see from what are standard practices for law enforcement. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan. I think you did a really good job of setting us up for why we need such widespread reforms of DHS. And it's important to think even before agents are deployed in our communities, we have to be smart about who these agents are. And that requires reform of recruitment, hiring, and training practices. We know that with the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there was a huge investment, about $30 million, specifically to hire more ICE and CBP officers. And earlier this month, DHS actually stated that they have already hired 12,000 new agents. And this, with the understanding that for years, ICE has had a hard time actually recruiting and hiring officers, raises a lot of alarm bells for us. It really is potentially concerning looking at, the tactics that are being used for recruitment, the quality of the candidates who are being recruited, as well as the training when they're on the job. We've seen with recruitment specifically an alarming rise of using sort of dog whistles for extremism in social media posts, raising concerns about people with extremist ideologies being specifically targeted for these roles. We see a reduction in standards, like reducing the minimum age for being an agent from 21 years, which is standard across most federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, down to 18 years of age. And we've also seen a reduction of training by several weeks without a clear understanding of what still is being required of agents for training. And we also know from past experiences, specifically with DHS, with hiring surges in the past, when CBP had a hiring surge from 2005 to 2011, unfortunately, we saw an increase in use of force complaints, racist incidents, and even convictions among officers. So we know what we're doing on the front end is really, really important to being able to protect our communities. And so there's a number of things that DHS and Congress can be doing right now to ensure that only the high quality candidates are being recruited for these positions. Congress should require that DHS report on all of the funding that they're spending on recruitment and ensuring that they have policies in place to specifically guard against hiring extremists in these roles. It's also very important for Congress to reinstate the National Law Enforcement Accountability Database, which was put in place by the previous administration and terminated by the current administration. This was basically a one-stop shop for federal agencies where they could go on and they could search use of force or misconduct complaints all in one place to ensure that candidates that had flags in their applications for these sort of complaints could be screened out. And it's also really important to understand what training is still currently in place in DHS and ensuring that their policies are appropriately guarding against inappropriate use of force. And we would also recommend that DHS specifically give guidance to their officers to ensure that they understand, what use of force policies are, and as also understand their requirements as it relates to their duty to intervene in instances where they are witnessing excessive use of force, and that they also have a responsibility to render aid. And so those are sort of the key things for recruitment, hiring, and training. And we also have additional reforms to recommend specifically around identification of officers. When the Trump administration really started to ramp up enforcement in early 2025, one of the first things that people were commenting on was the fact that there were, rampant unidentified officers in communities, agents who weren't wearing uniforms, often in plain clothes, often with covered faces, and a lot of times refusing to actually give any sort of personal identifier for who they were. So people weren't sure who was coming into their communities. In some cases, locals have actually reported that they've received increased 911 calls for things like kidnapping in their communities, only to find out that this was happening because there were unidentified federal agents conducting immigration enforcement. So this causes a lot of confusion and fear in communities, and can also, aid dangerous impersonators who then go undercover, pretend to be these agents, and continue to harm our communities. And this was actually such a big problem that the FBI issued a specific bulletin urging other agencies to require their agents to make sure that they are appropriately identifying themselves in actions. And so there's a very standard baseline that we are calling for these DHS officers, and that is to prohibit the use of facial coverings, specifically for the purpose of concealing one's identity, but of course allowing exceptions for health or environmental hazards, or in instances where it's necessary to protect an undercover agent's identity. And we're also calling on Congress to require that these agents wear uniforms that clearly state both their agency and provide a personal identifier like a badge or a personal name, so that there are mechanisms for accountability when these agents are actually in the field. And rather than these being, new standards, these are ones that federal, state, and local officers abide by every single day in our communities. So we're really just asking for DHS to be held to those same high standards of operation, and ensuring that they are operating in a way that's both transparent and accountable. We also had a recommendation in here about body cameras. And Secretary Noem actually announced earlier this week that they will be requiring body cameras to be worn by all officers. And while these cameras can provide important footage that can be used for accountability, we know that that footage is only as good as the investigations that follow and can actually hold people accountable for them. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Dan, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the importance of protecting independent investigations.
Thanks, Allie. And like you said, right, like we build these processes, but we still need to hold agents accountable. If for misconduct, we need to investigate use of force incidents. And I think one of the things that's been most concerning about particularly these two shootings was the efforts, it seems, by the Trump administration to not follow the normal procedures, to not let anyone involved in the investigation, and to seem like it was potentially to cover up the investigation. Like I think the American people expect the truth of what happened, and any time law enforcement is involved in a serious use of force or a potential allegation of misconduct, the only way to kind of preserve the integrity is to ensure there's an independent, thorough, and timely investigation. And normally, the way it should work is that you have cooperation between federal law enforcement's internal affairs bureaus or the offices of professional responsibility. You'd have cooperation with state and local law enforcement because they're the ones who are going to investigate any state criminal statutes, and then cooperation with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, and the FBI. And so I think that Congress needs to make sure and require that all of these agencies are working together, that the federal law enforcement shares information to the greatest extent possible with state and local law enforcement. They require DOJ and the FBI to open a civil rights review for any lethal use of force or any death in custody. Maybe that review finds there is no cause for a further investigation, but if you require that review, we make sure that these happen in an appropriate, quick and transparent process. And I think that the last piece is that we need to make sure that there's regular reporting to Congress and the public on use of force incidents, the reviews, what happens, what policy changes, and if discipline was a part of this. So I think one of the problems we're seeing is that many of the things that DHS is doing appear to kind of violate constitutional rights. And Ben, I'm going to let you turn over to you there. I know you've been looking at this issue a lot and what we can do about this. So.
For sure. A hallmark of America is that we have some pretty basic constitutional rights to make sure we're not deprived of our life, our liberty, to protect us against unlawful search or seizure without probable cause. These are things that Americans have been taking for granted literally for several hundred years now, really from the founding of our country. And what we're seeing is that they're not being respected by the ICE and CBP officers on the ground. And by policy of the Department of Homeland Security right now, even where it appears to conflict with the Constitution. And so let me go through a couple examples, but I will just say, part of the mission of the Department of Homeland Security is to keep Americans safe. Yeah. And that's not what we're seeing in these times. So I think the first thing I'll point to was that it recently came out that there was a memo that ICE lawyers put out in May 2025 that basically said ICE agents, CBP agents, could actually go into a home to arrest people even without a judicial warrant. This is very much against the spirit and I would argue the letter of the Fourth Amendment, which is that in general, to go into someone's home, law enforcement needs a judicial warrant unless there are truly exigent circumstances. And what we're seeing is now on the ground, this memo is being carried out by ICE and CBP agents, and that's actually happening not just as part of immigration enforcement, but also to citizens who are getting ensnared. And so there was a case of one citizen in Minnesota who literally they barged into his house, carried him out without clothes, and he was a citizen, and there was no judicial warrant that was presented. And the reason a judicial warrant is so important is that you have to show probable cause that this person should be arrested. And in many of these cases, there is no such probable cause. And so that's the first thing. I think the second thing is you are just seeing a whole lot of citizens get detained. There was a report by ProPublica that identified at least 170 U.S. citizens being detained in 2025, and I actually think that number is probably much, much higher now, given the operations in Minnesota. And so you see citizens that are getting detained. Why is that? So let's kind of break it apart. Number one, you're seeing immigration enforcement that is based on targeting of someone just based on their race or perceived race or ethnicity. And this is likely because the Supreme Court, the current extreme majority, ruled that in some cases you can use that as a factor, not the only factor, but I think in many of these cases it is the only factor being used. And for these so-called Kavanaugh stops after Justice Kavanaugh. Even he has tried to backtrack that in a recent case where he said, I didn't actually mean this effectively. The second thing is you have citizens who are getting stopped and they present identification, a real ID, and they say, see, I am actually a US citizen, and then the agents don't believe it. They either truly don't believe that it is a valid document, or they're just not listening. And so you have US citizens detained for hours, in some cases days. In some cases, these US citizens are literally being transported to other states across state lines, and in some cases, deported. And even where ultimately their identity is validated, they can be dropped off in the middle of nowhere without a ride home. So it's really troubling, and that's not how it's supposed to work. And we are not a carry papers country. Just to make really clear for anyone who's listening, there is no requirement for US citizens to carry identification with them at all times. And so it can't be used against you if you don't have an ID with you. And that can't be probable cause that you're not a citizen. And additionally, you see, because so many, as you've noted, so many of these officers have not been wearing body cameras, you've seen a really important and vital role being played by a lot of citizens, which is observing and documenting and recording. And that is guaranteed constitutional free speech. That is something that officers can't come over and take away your phone as long as you're not impeding what they're doing. And yet there are so many examples of US citizens being detained for doing this, having their phones snatched and kept, and even being threatened and coerced, saying, you know what, we're gonna put you on a domestic terrorist list if you keep doing this. And that's not constitutional. And we know from the killings that we've seen and some of these other terrible actions that it is only because of this citizen footage that we really have any sense of what's been going on. And the final problem that I'll sort of point out is that you've seen immigration enforcement be at odds with court orders. They have literally violated court orders. In Chicago and Minnesota, you've seen judges put out rulings to limit the use of certain riot controls and other kinds of sublethal weapons being used against protesters, clergy, journalists, and they've had to go back to judges to say, actually, these orders have been violated. And in fact, there was one judge, the chief judge in Minnesota, who recently put out a list of all of the times that he could find, at least very quickly, given how fast they have to be working these days, of ICE and CBP and DHS violating court orders. It was, I believe, 96 times from January 1st of this year only. And he noted that this is more times than some federal agencies have violated court orders in their entire existence. This is really, really troubling, because for us to have a rule of law on which our economy is predicated, our democracy is predicated, it means that the federal government needs to follow court orders. And so with that, let me go to a couple recommendations that we've put forward to try and address this. One, we obviously need DHS to rescind its unconstitutional memo saying that they can go in without a judicial warrant to people's homes. We need to make sure that DHS is investigating any violations of the Fourth Amendment. We need to make sure that DHS is tracking any time a citizen is detained or certainly deported. And if detained, we need to make sure in law that any presentation of a real ID, a birth certificate, a passport has to be accepted as bona fide documentation that they are in fact a citizen, and they have to be released right away. And where they may not have anything on them, there has to be a sort of a shot clock that's maybe about 3 hours, certainly no longer than that, by which if they're asserting they're a citizen and DHS can't prove otherwise, they have to release them after that time. They can't be held for days on end. And we need to absolutely make sure that there's no racial profiling happening. We need to prohibit these so-called Kavanaugh stops so that you don't have these roving patrols that are just going after anyone who might look like they're an immigrant. And we need a clear clarification from DHS that they will not harass people who are legally and lawfully recording and observing without impeding the operations. And finally, I'll just note that there needs to be some measure of accountability when people do violate Americans' constitutional rights. And so there needs to be a clear civil right of action when an immigration officer is violating the constitutional rights of that person. And so I'll turn it back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Ben. David, I'm going to turn it over to you because I think we've been talking about different elements of this, but DHS should have internal accountability mechanisms, right? Like these are not new problems, right? And what's happened to those internal watchdogs?
Yeah. So what happened at the beginning of this administration is that this administration so values transparency and accountability and the rule of law that they immediately decimated their own internal watchdogs that are in place so that they themselves, the agencies, follow the law and the procedures that they have in place. They decimated these watchdogs, and across the federal government, the Trump administration fired almost every inspector general. But they kept the inspector general for the Department of Homeland Security in place, which was an interesting decision. This inspector general, we use the term in our report, embattled, somewhat a charitable description. But in general, this inspector general has really not done very much to hold the administration accountable, and the Department of Homeland Security inspector general needs to do a lot more to actually do their job of being an internal watchdog. At the same time, the Congressional Republicans have given the Department of Homeland Security tens of billions of dollars in unaccountable money. We call it a slush fund in a report that we did last year through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last year. And that even though the discussion in Congress right now, which is about restraining and unlawful Department of Homeland Security activities, making sure that we have guardrails in place, the Trump administration has these billions of dollars in funding through the OBBA that are not subject to this appropriations process and the DHS funding right now. So a couple of points are important here. One, Congress needs to actually make sure that the money that was provided to the Department of Homeland Security last year is held accountable. Whatever is done with that money, there's different sort of theories on what they should do with that money. Secondly, this administration has denied members of Congress the ability to conduct oversight, which they're statutorily eligible to do. In part, first by denying them the oversight over DHS facilities funded by the appropriations process, and secondly by saying, wait a minute, you can't do any oversight at all. This facility is funded by the reconciliation bill, the OBBA, and so they're saying you can't even do this oversight. So we're calling for returning the lawful, appropriate oversight mechanisms to the Department of Homeland Security, making sure that DHS Inspector General actually does their job, and making sure that Congress has the right to these inspections, even of facilities that were funded by the slush fund that Congressional Republicans gave the Trump administration in the OBBA.
Turning to Congress, it's good timing. Laura, this is a moment when, over the last several weeks, we've seen members very engaged, particularly Democrats, but even Republicans, very concerned about what they're seeing. Can you help us understand what's actually happening with this fight over appropriations and what folks are calling for?
Of course. So just to take a step back where we are right now, Congress has 10 days now to get something put together for DHS funding. Yesterday, the House passed what the Senate had passed, which was basically taking the DHS funding out of a larger package that had another 5 agencies funded. This was actually quite a victory for the Democratic caucus. They basically saw an opportunity to break off DHS so that they could have a longer conversation about some of the reforms that needed to happen while continuing to fund 96% of the government. So a lot less pressure on Democrats, a lot more pressure on Republicans just on this alone. It may be tough to get a deal in the next 10 days, considering parties are pretty far apart on what they consider necessary reforms, let's say. So I'll start with this. Republicans and the administration clearly felt pressure to do something. This is unlike anything we've seen in the last year and a month from this administration. What we saw was a departure and an acknowledgement that something needed to change, that there was a line that was crossed, and so much so that the president himself was like, this is, I don't know about this account that this officer's giving us, and Republicans, instead of when Democrats started saying immediately, like, we need to talk about funding DHS, we can't fund them like this is, they've crossed a line, instead of doing their usual thing, which is like, this is a non-starter, we're not talking to you about this, we own the government. Many of them came right out and said, you know, we do need to separate this out, we need to have this conversation, things are kind of have gone off the rails. So there is an opportunity here for Congress that all of you at the table have described many of the things that could happen, but I'll start with a couple of things that both sides seem to agree on. The body cameras are certainly one of them. And while, you know, it was great news that Kristi Noem said, you know, body cameras for everyone and starting right now, they could backtrack on that tomorrow. And because there's no legal, there's no law saying that they have to do this. So while everyone's like, well, that's a great, you know, olive branch, but we're going to need some real certainty that you all are going to keep your end of the bargain up here, and this administration has demonstrated that they cannot be trusted on that, so we need to put this into law. And that's one piece, of course. We've seen a little bit of the oversight pieces. I do think, unlike, again, other areas of the government, there are Republicans who are looking at this and saying, you know, we're not fully ready to give up all of our power of oversight over the agencies that we are supposed to manage, that we are supposed to fund. The complications really are a couple of things. Number one, Republicans on the House have really thrown a few very big wrenches into the process. From the very beginning, Speaker Johnson said, you know, so many of these, all of these demands basically are non-starters for us. Like, we don't want to do any of this stuff. So, you know, we'll see what happens, but he kind of threw that out there. And then we have a small but loud group in the House Republican caucus that is calling for attaching a very, very much a poison pill, which is the SAVE Act, onto anything that's going to be funded going forward. And, you know, without getting into too much, this is something that would be incredibly detrimental to our electoral system. And on the Senate side, you would need 60 votes to pass anything. That would require 7 Democrats, and they've already said, like, anything with a SAVE Act in it is a non-starter. So we're already starting to see some real complications here. But again, there is an opportunity, and the pressure that Republicans in the administration have felt needs to be capitalized on, because it is a unique opportunity. And I think a lot of folks will tell you, like, they want to find something. They want to find something to do to point to some sort of reform that they will agree to, because the American people have been incredibly loud and have broken through and said, this is not okay. Yeah. And they know that now. So I think Democrats can really use this opportunity to get some meaningful things, whether it's, you know, codifying body cams and how they're used, talking about the, you know, investigations afterwards, but also cooperating with law enforcement, that local law enforcement is a very popular thing across both sides of the party, both sides of Congress. And one that is going to be very, very difficult, but is very important, I think, to push on, and we talked about this a little bit, is the warrants, judicial warrants, that would, in essence, stop that roving patrol. So that's where we are at this point.
No, and I think it's important that we use this time to these next few 10 days to kind of really push and try to see what's possible. But no, this is just the beginning. We're going to start to take your questions soon. A couple questions and welcome some discussion here. But you talked about this importance of cooperating. Some areas of common agreement around body cams, around cooperation with local law enforcement. Allie, I know you've looked at this issue and sort of how dangerous, masked, ununiformed officers, the federal officers, where there's no coordination, doing these actions, and how this puts communities at risk, it puts law enforcement at risk. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about, how these are kind of common accepted practices by most state local departments. So.
Yeah, I think you really just sort of hit the nail on the head there. I think just as Americans, we've come to believe that policing should be both transparent and accountable. Every day we have officers walking around our communities wearing uniforms. It's very easy to tell that they're officers. They're not covering their faces. And so I think that beyond just being able to hold people accountable, it really helps build relationships with community members. And what we've unfortunately seen, specifically a sheriff from Minnesota has pointed out the fact that by having all of these unidentifiable agents in communities, it's also straining relationships between communities and their local law enforcement. And particularly in communities that are trying to overcome problems with past incidences involving, use of force and in some cases police killings. This is really undermining the important work that the locals are doing. And so I think that this goes broader than DHS or even federal law enforcement, but really just hits to the heart of what we have come to expect from our law enforcement more generally.
Yeah. Then, there's been additional reporting over the last few weeks on, you mentioned how DHS is kind of harassing protesters, potentially monitoring protesters. We're learning more as new reporting comes out. And what can Congress do to protect America's Fourth Amendment rights against this growing surveillance apparatus that, seems targeted on, all of us?
Well, you bring up a really important point. And surveillance and government surveillance is something that I think is of a concern to people across the ideological spectrum, right? You see folks in the Freedom Caucus in the House and also among progressives, in the House care about some of these things. What do we know? We know that there are reports that from the OBBA money, DHS has been buying a lot of advanced technological tools that they are deploying. And if you look at some of the materials online on the government websites around their contracts, there are no exclusions for how those could be used on citizens. And that is exactly how then they're getting deployed. Yeah. So you see that DHS is buying location data on Americans, sort of doing a end run around what normally would require a warrant by just buying it from private data brokers to see perhaps who's at protests or who's in a particular area at a certain time. They're using facial recognition software, again, apparently on citizens, because there have been reports of citizens who have been pulled over and then addressed by name by ICE or CBP officers. And there are even some tools that they've purchased to hack into phones. It's unclear if that's been used on citizens or not. And of course, just basic use of social media analytics and license plate readers. So, I think there's a lot that Congress could do here. First, they could simply close that loophole and say the federal government can't buy data on Americans that they can't get otherwise without a judicial warrant. And so that's a pretty easy fix. There's legislation on that that they could move forward on. And Congress could also apply additional restrictions on how Americans can be surveyed. Of course, there are also court cases that are currently pending challenging their use of some of these tools. Some of it is that we need to see information come out about how they actually are, and that's still kind of filtering out. There were a couple blockbuster stories even just this week that detailed that. So that's one thing. I think the other thing I'll just add is that you've seen this White House, this administration has made no bones about picking fights with what they perceive as their political enemies. The president put forward something called NSPM 7, which tried to target the national security state on Antifa, even though you can't really define who Antifa is, and they don't really try. And so it means that you can suddenly, potentially, use a whole bunch of surveillance tools and law enforcement task forces to go after those that just are exercising their First Amendment rights. And so that's something that Congress should definitely think about, how certain authorities might be misused and look for possible reforms.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to turn to some audience questions, but before I do, some have been calling for Congress to abolish ICE. I think people are very upset about what they're seeing. Dabo, how do you respond to these calls, and what can we do on a bigger structural level here? So,
I think, I'm not a historian, but I think it's safe to say that at least in modern American history, we've always had some form of immigration enforcement. Prior to 9/11, it was the INS, which was part of the Department of Justice. And after 9/11, we had the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and CBP and ICE being part of that to take on that function. I think, as a country, we have to have the enforcement of the laws, and that includes our immigration laws. And that can be done in a way that's fair and consistent and humane and lawful. And that's not what we're seeing right now. What we're seeing right now is the very agency tasked with protecting the homeland, safeguarding Americans' rights, is violating people's rights, is breaking the law. And I think this gives us an opportunity to really have the conversation we're having right now. What is immediately in front of us is momentum in Congress, pressure and support from the American people for reforms to the Department of Homeland Security. Some of the measures that we've suggested here at the Center for American Progress we think are really reasonable, common sense reforms. The bigger picture question of what to do about the Department of Homeland Security and the reforms that a future administration, which is 3 long years away, might end up doing is, whether those are big or small reforms, is something that will only be a live issue when we have a new administration in 3 years. And what we have right now is a real problem, and the opportunity and the political momentum to actually do something about it.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I think also you're starting to see a little bit of congressional interest and oversight from those in the majority in the House and Senate, but only after this absolute outcry from Americans across the political spectrum. Congress has routinely, over the many past decades, engaged in rigorous oversight, regardless of the power of the party in power in the White House, when it seems like they're violating rights or doing something that's wrong. And so you could also see a much more vitalized Congress doing the kinds of oversight and iteratively putting in place restrictions when something's not going right or making a reform as is needed. And so there's a clear role for Congress just at a basic level to do that oversight.
I think one of the things that's been most troubling is we just don't have answers to a lot of these questions, right? Whether it is requiring transparency of officers with uniforms, who are they? What are they doing? What authorities are they doing this? No transparency around investigations, like surveillance, like Congress needs to sort of start to get the bottom of this first, and then can get working on a whole range of reforms, right? I think, David, you talked, right? We've been focusing on ICE and CBP and some of these law enforcement functions of DHS, but DHS does a lot of things, many things which are necessary and many things which need to work better, right? I think we all have complaints about times we've gone through TSA or things that, what can we do to protect us, keep us safe, protect people's rights? Going to some of these questions that we're getting online, Ben, I might start with you about the measures that state and local governments can do to kind of rein in ICE and CBP. I mean, there's been a lot of pressure on governors, on mayors, on attorneys general, on over the last year, and to be curious about what you feel like are some of the most successful ways that they've been pushing against this. So,
Well, I think there's actually a really promising approach that some states are considering, and that's to pass, it's pretty basic, it's to pass a state law that allows citizens to sue when any law enforcement, state, local, federal, violate constitutional rights. Right now, it is very hard to hold any federal law enforcement officer accountable when they violate your rights. And that's a combination of both case law from the Supreme Court and also just the statutes that Congress has passed. But this would be, this thing called, some people have called a reverse 1983 provision, could be a way for states to create some accountability when federal law enforcement come in and patently and just very clearly violate their rights. So I think that's a first step and a very important step that states and localities could take.
Yeah, I'd say other things that I've been seeing is, the importance of, documenting, what's happening. We've seen, state attorney general's offices, mayor's offices, governor's offices playing a role of, obviously pushing back in litigation, sort of documenting when people's rights are violated, when we see these abuses of power. Of course, I think one of the things Congress can do to help on these law enforcement abuses is requiring coordination with state and local law enforcement. So if someone does violate the law and it's clear that they're going above and beyond what they need to do to conduct their federal enforcement actions, which I think we've seen over and over again, that those individual officers can be held accountable. And sometimes that does mean criminal prosecution by a state agency. So looking at this debut, I might ask this a question. What can be done to improve conditions and oversight of immigration detention centers? We've been thinking a lot about what's happening on our streets, but there's a growing population of people who are being held in detention by this administration.
Yeah, this administration we only have to go back to the horrible days of the family separation crisis that the Trump administration decided to inflict upon those families in the first term, to know that the conditions for people that are held in their custody have not been a priority. And I think that is where public pressure and the role of Congress is really key. I mean, there are some tangible things. For example, Congress can require that any appropriated funds can only go to facilities that meet a certain minimum level of care. Congress can fund much better care for people in custody, and Congress can also limit the unaccountable and runaway detention and deportation operation that the Trump administration is trying to put in place.
No. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Just wanted to add, so just to put a finer point on something that Debu mentioned here about how Congress can restrict funds. So something that was mentioned earlier is the $75 billion in OBBBA money that ICE and CBP have. Right now, as things stand, these are not things that can be restricted, right? Like this is what, as Debu called it, a slush fund, right? There are no restrictions on how it can be used. This opportunity right now that they have can also affect that pot of money. And so when they're talking about, whatever restrictions they're trying to have, it needs to also, they need to ensure that it also pertains to the OBBBA funds, because they will differentiate, right, between, what they can do with this money and what they can do with the other money. So I just wanted to kind of put a finer point on one of the things that Congress can do to really help with whether it's detention centers or other things that we've talked about here.
And Laura, I'll just quickly add, thank you, totally agree with that point. And also just that, we've had deaths in custody under this administration just this year, and we're only in, the beginning of February. And we've had multiple deaths in Trump's ICE's custody, just in the first month of this year. And there was a case that we talked about in our report where the autopsy report findings was of a homicide, and the Department of Homeland Security's official representation did not make that finding. And it was contradicted by the autopsy report. And so, we're this administration's word can't be trusted. And so it's up to Congress and the American people to demand accountability, because this administration is not being truthful in their representations, even when everyone before their own eyes can see what is happening, as we just saw in Minnesota.
And, we get a question a little bit on how does Congress actually get these reforms possible? I think one of the things that people are frustrated with is what kind of enforcement mechanisms are there, to make sure that DHS is, complies with court orders, complies with congressional requests. And, sometimes Congress has to get a little creative on these things and would welcome thoughts on what are those sort of creative tactics or ways that you can kind of, when you get resistance from the administration to demand results. So.
The first thing I'd say is follow the money.
Yeah.
If an agency is not following the law, if an agency is defying court orders, Congress has the right to withhold the money from that agency, either for certain activities or more broadly, until that's addressed. And this wouldn't be the first time that would happen in history. So I think the power of the purse from Congress is very powerful. I think the second thing is where you have an ability of individuals to vindicate their own constitutional rights by bringing civil actions against those who violate it, that creates a very, very powerful enforcement mechanism against an agency. And so I would also just reemphasize that. I think more broadly, I think judges are starting to accelerate what they might be willing to do by threatening to bring in agency heads, potentially hold agency officials in contempt. And ultimately, some of that is going to have to play out and probably go up to the Supreme Court. But and that will take time. It would be better for Congress to act more quickly. The courts tend to be a little slower, but there still are steps that they can take to try to bring some compliance to the agency.
And the only thing that I would add here is, I would say just to kind of, I think it bears repeating that the only reason we're in this moment right now of possibilities for reform is because of the American people, the folks on the ground who are recording those videos and putting their bodies in the way of ICE agents and people that they are abusing. And so I think it's important for Congress to recognize that the power of the people is going to always be that much greater than their own, and really bringing those voices to light and making sure that it's not forgotten and continues to stay top of mind is going to be hugely important, because as we get longer, as we get further away from these murders, people tend to move on and forget, and we cannot let that happen. So Congress needs to make sure that they are continuing to highlight all of that and highlight the voices of those people that are on the ground who've made this moment possible.
Is there an alternative to these aggressive enforcement tactics that we're seeing, right? Like this is surely not the way it's supposed to work, right? And you talked about the need to enforce the law, but Ali, Debu, what is a better way to actually conduct these kinds of street enforcement actions? So.
On the policing side, do you want to take that one?
I think one of the most important things that we've pointed out a lot of different things here is that when this enforcement is happening, that it's happening legally and it's happening using the best standards that we have available for law enforcement. And so there are a lot of models and guides already for how we should be doing this. And I think it's important to underscore the fact that in a lot of these cases, these officers are just administering administrative warrants. There's really no need for a lot of the machinery that we're seeing in all of these things. So there's definitely an alternative. But I think it's also important to recognize that, we have to ask the question is, why are there so many people in this country who don't have a pathway to citizenship that's actually keeping them vulnerable to these aggressive enforcements in the first place? And so I think that we also need to be thinking about ways to create legal pathways for people so that this enforcement, doesn't have the level of force that it has. And in an administration where these aggressive tactics are being used, it will be easier to sort of narrow in on them.
One of the things that I've found shocking is how heavily armed and armored these agents are for actions which oftentimes are not the worst of the worst, right? The administration likes to talk about that they were going to go after the worst of the worst. And there are dangerous people in this country. There are dangerous people that federal law enforcement deals with. But the vast majority of these people have never been convicted of a crime, right? And they're coming in with, lawn guns and armor and helmets and military style. The militarization, I think, is something that's incredibly concerning and dangerous. I think it makes the whole situation dangerous. You add into this how many new ICE agents, and CBP officers, what kind of training are they doing? They're issuing them with rifles, with all sorts of less lethal devices. They're using flashbangs. They're using, escalating situations when they don't need to.
I have a question, which is how, the local police in this country deal with violent criminals all the time. How often do you see images on our local news about windows of cars being smashed and people being grabbed?
Yeah.
And yet that's what we're seeing all the time with immigration enforcement.
I'll just add a quick comment, which in the arrest of the Tufts University graduate student for exercising her First Amendment rights in the op-ed that she wrote, a former DHS official, law enforcement official, was quoted in a press report that he'd seen drug traffickers taken down with less overt aggression than the student.
Yeah.
And that just goes to show that this administration's priorities are totally out of whack with any kind of reasonable, legitimate public security, national safety prioritization. And instead, they've just focused on low-hanging fruit in terms of easy targets, someone who they know, whether it's students, whether that's people they just encounter in the street, whether that's people at courthouses. They're going after people that are trying to comply. And to your point, Ali, I think it's clear that you can have both the enforcement of the law and the protection of the American public safety without these tactics that we've seen that are unlawful and just completely unacceptable.
Yeah. Just the final question we got here is how to elaborate on how ICE and CBP agents can be held accountable for their actions. I'm happy to talk a little bit about how the system's supposed to work, but welcome other ideas. I think the more that we can ensure that there's these thorough investigations, that multiple agencies are taking part in it, the more likely that you're going to get the best possible investigation. We need to start to get that evidence, make sure it's shared between the appropriate agencies, and then whether it's civil rights violations, whether it's criminal code violations, whether it's internal policies around the use of force, that the important information can come to light. The correct agency enforcement, and discipline process can take place, and then I think a big piece of this is transparency, right? Like, it can't be this, denying information, not answering congressional questions, this black box of like, we'll look into it or not looking into it. There needs to be an understanding of here's what we found in these use of force investigations. Here is how people are being held accountable. Sometimes that may mean someone needs to be removed from their position. Sometimes that may mean criminal charges. And sometimes that may need a change in policy and training, like oftentimes. And that's why you need that regular reporting to Congress, regular public reporting as well.
I would also just add that you see several governors now have encouraged citizens to submit any documentation or evidence of lawbreaking by federal law enforcement to the state attorney general, to the governor's office, because in many cases, federal crimes have a statute of limitations of 5 years, right? That goes beyond this administration.
Yeah.
And so whether it's a federal crime or a state crime that may have been committed, there still is an opportunity for accountability.
Great. We're about to wrap up, but wanted to open it up if anyone wanted to give any more final statements or thoughts before we leave.
So I just will reiterate, especially for all the folks that are kind of out there listening to this, the pressure cannot be let up. This is an incredibly unique and important moment. We have an administration that never wants to change anything that they're doing, and a Republican caucus that generally is fine to just do whatever the president wants them to do. This is a very unique moment, but it can go away if pressure is not felt. So for anyone out there who has the ability to call their members, call their senators, organize stuff on the ground in their states and their cities, talk to local law enforcement, this is the moment to do that. This is the moment to organize. This is the moment to push. And I just can't stress that enough, because this is really this is a unique moment, and I'd love to see it taken advantage of in the best way, the strongest way we can.
Yeah, I think you said it better than any of us could, and you know, I think we owe a great deal to the people who are on the ground in these communities, not just in Minnesota, but throughout the country, who've been protesting, who've been filming, who've been sharing things, and who've been you know, calling their lawmakers and demanding change. And you know, hopefully this is just the beginning of a great deal to come. Thank you so much.